Hello everyone, and thanks for coming. It's a privilege to be with you this evening, and all of us have one thing in common, I think, and that is that we all have kind of a passion for history. And I just want to say that my wife, Kathy Calvert, is an author as well, and she just finished completing a book on the Yoho National Park. But she's also done other books. She did a book on Bert Mickle, who was from the Millerville area, and she also did a book on her father, Don Forrest, and she co-wrote a book with me on mountain rescue, Guardians of the Peaks, and it's about mountain rescue in the Canadian Rockies and the Columbia Mountains. I think reading books impacts us on how we look at life. When I was a young adult, Knut Hamsun, Hemingway, Melrose, Steinbeck, Lawrence Durrell had a significant influence on me. But it was in my teenage years when writers like R.M. Patterson's Buffalo Head, Rich Hobson's Grass Beyond the Mountain, and James Ramsey Ullman's Banner in the Sky captured my imagination. Of course, let's not forget the Hardy Boys. When I went to work in Jasper as a seasonal warden, early in my career, I quickly realized the people that live up there are into the fur trade. And coincidentally, or maybe meant to be, my district that summer included Athabasca Pass and Thompson's route through to the Columbia River. I'm now working on the second part of this book. And I've done a lot of research on the events leading up to the creation of the mystery of how Hooker and Brown became mythical mountains. And that was something that really mapped out the early Canadian Rockies with climbers, mountaineers, hiring outfitters, and they were predominantly from Europe, mostly Great Britain, and the United States, who came here looking for all of these unclimbed peaks. The second subject that intrigued me was the first white settler in the Jasper area, and his name was Lewis Swift. As a young man, he drove stagecoach from Bismarck to Deadwood, South Dakota in the Black Hills, and he was an acquaintance of Wild Bill Hickok and Calamity Jane. He was also there to experience the fallout of Custer's last stand. Mary Schaefer of Moline Lake fame had this to say about Lewis. Lewis Swift was one of those remarkable breed known all over the western states as mountain men. Several of his kind had wandered into Alberta: Jack Gregg of Prairie Creek, Sam Livingston, who settled in Calgary, Dan Noyes, and others, wandering about with a couple of pack horses, a few traps, a gun, some flour, beans, and bacon, and a gold pan. They would build a shack in some chosen spot and proceed to earn their living there for a year or two until the itch to wander would send them off in some new direction. This book is a memoir chronologically following my career in the mountains of Western Canada up until the 1980s, when I became a handler working with police service dogs. But it's not just about me, it's about the many men and women I had the privilege of working with and for, the historical events I encountered, and the people I learned about or came across that involved a broad range of subject material, often told with humor, sometimes involving tragedy, but always trying to give the reader a taste of what it was like to be a guide, packer, and wrangler, then a park warden in our mountain national parks during the 1960s and 70s. I was born in the West, in Kamloops, BC, and when I was 5, we moved to North Bay, Ontario. My father was in the Air Force, and he was being posted overseas for a year. We spent that year living in a motel in North Bay. Later, we moved to CFB Downsview, just on the outskirts of Toronto. When I was 8, we headed back west while on vacation to visit family and friends. On the way, we stopped to visit my mother's relatives that lived in Winnipeg Beach, Manitoba. Seeing our many cousins and visiting the beach attraction was, as expected, fun for two young boys. However, it was my first sight of the mountains that was an epiphany in every sense of the word. On the top of a big hill west of Calgary, I got my first real good view of the Rockies. It was like coming home. The feeling was there for only a few fleeting moments, but it registered with me like a stamp in a passport. Off in the distance were the rolling grasslands that extended into the timber-crowned foothills that marched aggressively up to the mountains beyond. Nestled below us was the small town of Cochrane. Actually, it was a village then. In 1954, Cochrane was a cow town with no more than 700 people. The main street ran east-west. Most of the businesses were on the north side, facing south, allowing the afternoon sun to warm their windows and door fronts. We parked in front of a hotel with a tavern. Not far away were some hitching rails right out of a movie set. This boded well for us to see a cowboy, maybe on horseback, riding through town and verify our image of the Canadian West. Our parents bought us ice cream from a nearby store and left us sitting in the back seat while they went in for a beer. We were there for an hour or so, long enough for the ice cream to fade as a bribe. The monotony was broken by the odd stringy cowboy strolling by in his faded blue jeans, dusty boots, often with a cigarette dangling from his lips. Some stopped and stepped into the bar. We peered at the doorway as they entered. We were disappointed not to see the expected gun belts and holsters being worn or checked at the door. Mom and Dad finally came out and we headed for Banff. Dad mentioned that a fight was about to break out over an argument in the men's section and that it was a pretty rough place and it was time to hit the road. That was music to my ears. When I think about the Cochrane I saw as a boy, I'm reminded of another town I would see many decades later after a couple of long days driving a pickup truck down an endless dusty road in South America. Our journey finally came to an end in a small frontier town. Scattered along the main street were a few vehicles, the odd Vescaro on horseback, and some necessary structures, hitching rails and a livery steed. The town was in a wide valley next to a deep azure stream. The distant mountains could be seen in all directions. It brought back memories of my first trip west, and the town's name had a familiar ring to it, Cochrane, Chile. I went to the mountains in 1965 for good, and I got a job at Deer Lodge in Lake Louise. Earlier that year, a story broke in the Calgary Herald about a woman lost in a storm on the Illecillewaet Glacier near Rogers Pass. It had left a lasting impression with me over the years. After all these decades, her family contacted me and has found some closure to what unfolded so many years ago in my story of her in this book. This is part of it. In the spring of 1965, the search for Peggy Telfer spread across the pages of the Calgary Herald, and I was riveted by the news. It played out like a mystery drama for me, and still does, even after all these years. And I'm not the only one. The older climbing community in Calgary and Banff still remembers Peggy Telfer today. And if you bring up her name, many old-timers will say, "Of course, I remember Peggy. She was such a fine gal." After she disappeared, a storm came in for 2 days, hindering the search effort. But on the third day, the weather broke clear and sunny. A much-needed helicopter was now employed in the search. They came upon a pair of skis sticking vertically out of the snow. Just past the skis, jutting out of the surface, was the end of a ski pole with a loop handle exposed. In the loop was a hand. She had laid down to wait for her returning chums, her skis crossed as a marker. The rest of her was completely buried in snow. Her death marked a big change in how ski parties behaved on trips to the mountains. A pamphlet was produced on avalanche safety. The contents of the brochure included what should be carried in a day pack while traveling in avalanche terrain. The drawing on the cover was of a small hand with a loop around its wrist that was just sticking out of the snow. Peggy's legacy lives on in the measures that are now in place today to ensure safe travel in the mountains. The year she died was the same year I moved to the mountains to remain. But it would be 4 more years before the challenges of mountain rescue would become my challenge as well. Before that, I had a lot of country to ride, trails to explore, and much to learn. I got a job at Deer Lodge, like I said, that summer, and I was working in the laundry with a couple of Polish girls. In August, I was in a climbing accident and spent a week in a hospital in Banff recovering, My doctor was Dr. Titamore, and he told me about the fateful Mexican women's expedition to climb Mount Victoria in 1954. He had been on the rescue. He was trying to emphasize to me that the mountains can be a dangerous place to play in. There were 7 women and their male guide on the mountain that day at the end of July. The guide and 3 of the women never came back alive. Back in the hotel room, the expedition leader was reluctantly forced to take her thoughts back to that troubled and devastating experience on the mountain while giving an exclusive interview to a reporter from the Calgary Herald. From the room's picture window, you could see the turquoise lake and in the background, the glimmering mountain. Below the south summit, you could unmistakably see the telltale skid marks of death. Fortunately for her, weather soon moved in, obscuring the view. Through an interpreter, she told her story. What never came out was why they made that fateful decision to go back down the way they had come up, instead of taking the safer and easier route back down along the ridge. There were several tourists milling about when they brought the bodies down. Suddenly, a string of horses came out of the trees in front of the chateau. Amidst the din of the horses' feet, you could hear clearly repeated by a few people closer up, bodies. And then a hush fell over all of them. The only sound was the footfall of the hooves on the gravel. Across the lake, you could see the indifferent presence of Mount Victoria. They carried the climbers wrapped in canvas, one draped in a foreign flag. Someone said, "I think it's a Mexican flag." It must have sent a chill through all of them on that hot and sunny afternoon. The Mexican tragedy was followed the next year by an even more devastating accident on Mount Temple, where 7 Boy Scouts from Philadelphia were killed in an avalanche. Controversy surrounded both accidents. With regard to the Mexican women, many made it a gender issue, and some even claimed that the sport wasn't suitable for women. Some went so far as to say it was too mentally and physically challenging for the weaker sex. To me, it was a mountaineering accident that just happened to involve women who had a male guide. The 7 boys died on Mount Temple as a result of incompetence on the part of the male leader, who was never taken to task over it. His peers back in Philadelphia protected him. They actually blamed Banff National Park for not informing them of the avalanche danger. It was later established they had never even sought advice. I got work in Banff that fall constructing Harmony Mall, which would eventually house Minot Sports and Harmony Drugs. Finding accommodation back then in Banff wasn't as difficult as it is today. Andy and Joan Knight ran a boarding house in Banff that a lot of us came and went from during our early months and years there. The house was located on Link Street, and Rob Crosby owned it. It had several individual rooms upstairs, which Andy and Joan rented or sublet to staff working around Banff. It was like one big family, and we all had access to the living room and the use of the kitchen. The living room was always a center for conversation and relaxation. Most of us men, because of our lack of culinary skills early in life, preferred to run a tab at the old modern cafe where the Magpie and Stump is today. The local watering holes were either the King Edward or Cascade hotels, which shut down early in those days. The Modern was just down the street on the same block as the King Edward, and became the magnet that drew everyone for the final meal of the day. Here you could carry on the social scene, minus alcohol, in a place where food was served, and it was always full after the bar closed. Banff was a source of colorful characters back then, and one of the most unforgettable was Timberline Jim Deegan. Jim had a flair for making his presence known in rather dramatic fashion. On one occasion, after spending his usual lengthy time out in the wilds of Banff's backcountry, he was just a tad parched for that amber liquid that was drawn from the taps of the Cascade Hotel. So after a shit shave, shower, and a shampoo, he went down to see the boys at the Cascade and entered with much fanfare and bravado. As he sauntered up to the bar, he saw his buddies sitting about. Seeing this congenial company inspired him to instruct the waiter to anoint the mahogany. And off they went with their trays full, passing out Deegan's round to all who were present. Then once everyone had been provided for and the din of the crowd had settled down, he stood at attention at the front of the bar and announced with great flair, "When Deegan drinks, everyone drinks." With that, he tossed his beer back in one thirsty gesture. A great roar came forth from the patrons, and in unison all saluted Deegan's presence and drank from their glass. After taking another glass of beer off the counter, he downed it slower, savoring it, and everyone followed. He then reached into his pocket and pulled out a dime. With one quick flip, he tossed the coin onto the counter and then announced to one and all, "When Deegan pays, everyone pays." That wouldn't be the first or the last time he was thrown out of that place. The following summer, I got hired by Bud Brewster in Lake Louise, guiding dudes to the end of the lake and back. And then that fall, I went to work for Bert Mickle, who was based at a Temple Lodge in Skoki Lodge, and worked for them for the next few years. My horse background came through my Uncle Kenny and my dad, and their involvement in the sport of kings, thoroughbred racing, while my later involvement was in the king of sports, chasing wild horses. At the time, my dad's youngest brother, Kenny, was involved with thoroughbred horses as a trainer. The two of them were very close, and after Dad retired from the military, he bought some thoroughbreds as claimers and started training and racing them. Kenny started out as a stable hand in his youth. Then he became a jockey because of his slight stature. When that career ended, when he grew older and gained weight, he established himself as a horse trainer. He was very good at it and was soon hired by renowned Calgary newspaper publisher Max Bell, who had a racing stable. The Bell Ranch, which he owned and operated with his business partner Frank McMahon, was located near Okotoks, Alberta, on the Sheep River. His racing and breeding facilities was called Golden West Farms. Located on the land is the prominent glacier deposit and erratic rock that Okotoks is named and known for. Okotoks means rock in the Blackfoot language. The rock is revered by the Blackfoot people. By the late 1960s, it had also become a landmark for the climbing community in Calgary. The ranch was a large spread that held magnificent facilities for raising, breeding, and training thoroughbreds. My father would often take us there on weekends where we would roam about and explore the countryside, as well as watch the horse operation. Once in a while, I got to ride one of the quieter working horses that were kept there. I always rode bareback, and on one occasion I fell off while loping across the field in front of my dad and uncle. When I got up, I heard my father say to my uncle, "I guess it doesn't run in the family." That kind of hurt, and I wondered if he'd ever ridden bareback. There was a guest house in the ranch where Bell's friends would stay and visit. Bing Crosby was one of them. He made everything more exciting for us as we never knew when he might show up, and we would get a glimpse of him. It was foolish optimism on our part, but you could always hope. Next to E.P. Taylor, who owned Northern Dancer, Max Bell was the leading breeder in the country and the most prominent in Western Canada. He was introduced to horse racing by the American Hall of Fame jockey Johnny Longden, who said of Bell, "I owe everything I have to that man. He was the finest man I have ever met in racing." I got a job as a park warden in 1969. And that fall I was offered a couple of winter jobs for the season. One breaking horses at the Yoho, a government ranch which is west of Sundre. The other chasing snowflakes in Rogers Pass. I took the second one because I knew nothing about avalanches and needed the experience for my resume. I worked for a couple of Austrian brothers, Fred and Walter Slice. I have a few interesting stories from this period. One of them is about Noel Gardner, who was the father of avalanche forecasting and research in Canada. Noel Gardner was the first to see the coming tide of social change in the Canadian Rockies. He was a cowboy with a ranching background whose family spread extended along the south bank of the Elbow River, north of Bragg Creek. Today, the Boy Scouts of Canada's Camp Gardner bears the family name. He was the son of Clem Gardner, a world-class bronc rider, who, along with Guy Whittick's dream and financing from the Big Four ranchers, Pat Burns, George Lane, A.E. Cross, and A.J. McLean, created the Calgary Stampede in 1912. Clem was its first all-around cowboy. Noah was well known for being hard-nosed with staff, especially those outside his realm of authority. You'd have thought the Slice brothers, Fred and Walter, would have had to put up with the same strict demands from Noel as everyone else, but that wasn't the case. Noel respected them because he knew they brought a great deal of knowledge from their work in the European Alps, but also had a good relationship with other old country guides, such as Bruno Engler and Hans Moser. He arrived in the mountains in the early 1940s and took up guiding dudes on horseback into Skoki for Lizzie Rummel. In the winter, he often packed in supplies on skis with a big pack. He was also attracted to the lifestyle the mountains offered. Working there also provided an opportunity for him to put some distance between him and his hard-as-nails father, who tried to mold Noel to his particular liking. Noel was a big man with a strong personality and a fearsome look, who tended to dominate those around him. He had a stern temper, and with his physical build, was an intimidating presence, which helped him get his way. This was especially apparent with his supervisors, who were always being challenged by his rogue vision and strong personality. He was a freight train of will, putting his thoughts into action, which often led to rubbing people the wrong way, especially his peers and supervisors, or his superiors. He saw the need for a rescue capability within the Warden service long before anyone else, particularly in avalanche rescue. This fascination with snow and avalanches set him on an important research path. Noel was committed to the idea of wardens becoming involved in rescue scenarios that he felt would inevitably become the park's responsibility. In this, he was considered more far-sighted than his supervisors, which must have been frustrating for a man of his temperament. He realized the task ahead was going to be monumental, and the training required was far beyond the scope of the small yearly ski schools. I've got a story here. I got two stories, but one's I think I'll probably let it slip, seeing that we have tender ears in the room. It's not a very good one anyway. One incident that winter stands out in my mind. I was an assistant observer at the lens gun position on a storm shoot. I was a typical night shoot in the Canadian Army. The gun location was about 100 yards up the road from the lens avalanche shed in the middle of the slide path. It was not originally located in direct threat of being hit by avalanches, but over the years, the path had been widened by these large slides until the gun position was exposed. The practice at night was to shoot the gun, and then everyone remained silent, as the only indication that the shot was successful would be the sound of the muffled detonation high up on the mountain, and possibly the subsequent avalanche. Because it was so dark and the danger involved, everyone's senses were heightened. We had no idea how far the slide would come, or if it would come at all. The first audible sound in the encompassing darkness was the woof of the exploding shell. After a short, indeterminate time, the next sound we heard was the distant bellow of rushing air, followed by a slight hint of stirring trees higher up. At this point, we started to run. A low rumble followed, and we could hear the sharp sound of snapping branches. On this last revelation, we put our heads down and ran like hell for the protection of the shed. All I could think of as I ran was whether we had lingered too long at the gun site and missed the subtler sounds of the impending avalanche. When we got to the shed, I had a sense of exhilaration that we had cheated imminent death. Suddenly there was the sound of the avalanche roaring overhead like a freight train. We got back to the gun position, and we found everything covered in snow and pushed around like dinky toys. That summer, Fred relocated the gun position farther up the road, out of the path of the slide. I went to Jasper in 1970 on a promotion and was assigned to Tonquin Valley, and which includes the Whirlpool River and the Athabasca Pass, which was the fur trade route to the Columbia River. And this story is about a well-known outfitter from Jasper and his wife, Tom and Faye McCready, and a trip up the Whirlpool to cut out the trail. Cane Meadows is named for Canadian artist Paul Kane, who traveled over the pass in November 1846 with the Fur Brigade heading west. He spent the winter and summer on the west coast, painting the coastal natives. Then in October 1847, he left boat encampment for the Athabasca Valley on his way home to Montreal. Throughout his epic trip, he detailed this landscape and the native peoples who inhabited it. In innumerable paintings, he etched their features, their impressive clothing, and their everyday life. Later, he wrote one of the most fascinating of Canada's early travel books, Wanderings of an Artist. We set up camp near a small clump of trees in the meadow, not far from a silk-laden creek coming off a glacier, high up on mythical Mount Hooker. The location provided us with spectacular scenery in every direction. With abundant firewood and fresh water close by, it would be our home for the next 4 days as we hacked and cut our way to the pass. After a hearty breakfast the next morning, Tom and I headed out on foot with a can of gas, a chainsaw, saddle axes, and bagged lunches. We left Faye behind with a good book as we battled our way towards Committee Punch Bowl in Athabasca Pass. It was 5 miles to the summit, and the trail was ill-defined in places with lots of boggy stretches and the biggest stand of Engelmann spruce you could imagine. The canopy, though, was less dense than you would expect, providing enough light to allow all kinds of shrubs and plants to flourish. It was a botanist's heaven. As we neared the pass, we were cheered on by many small meadows, brilliantly covered in a host of wildflowers. Radiantly red Indian paintbrush, yellow heart-shaped arnica, tall, bodacious blue and purple larkspur, along with the muted blue fleabane, all competing to cover these small clearings. They even infiltrated the forest floor, encouraged by a warm and sunny summer. It was slow going as we sweated away well into the late afternoon until we ran out of gas and had to return to camp. That night we sat around the fire, and Tom entertained me with some stories of his early years in the mountains. He was a tremendous axeman, and I think prouder of that skill than his reputation as a gentle and sure-handed horseman with stock. His axe was always sharp, and he often honed it at night around the fire, immersed in meditative thought. Some of you might know Mac Elder. Mac Elder lives in Cochrane, distant neighbor. He worked in Jasper as a park warden in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And he's a really good storyteller. And this is one of his numerous humorous tales from that era. I took it from an oral history. I had another funny one that I'll tell you. When I was in there, Jasper, in that high use area, I was right across the street from the fire hall, the warden office, and the ambulance, and Bev Hunter, the warden dispatcher, she came in and said, "Mac, can you take an ambulance call?" I said, "I guess so. Where am I going?" She said, "I don't know. The reporting people are over at the fire hall. They're desperate." So I went over there. It was about 11:30 in the morning. Anyway, there was a guy who had an ambulance parked in front of the door, and I said to him, "Who's going with me?" He said, got nobody. I said, "Well, where am I going?" He said, "To the post office." Well, that's just the right next building practically. So I recruited a guy off the street there, and I said, "Come on with me, I've got an ambulance call." He was a warden that was in town that day. He said, "I don't want to do that." I said, "To hell with you, you're coming." So we went over there, and I couldn't park. I had to double park in the middle of the street. So we got in there, and the poor old guy is dead in the middle of the floor. So anyways, we gather him up, and we put him in the basket and stuck him in this ambulance and go to the hospital emergency, and they're pouring cement. I couldn't get in. I had to go around to the front door. So we packed this guy in through the front door. The doctor said to me, "Mac, why did you guys bring this guy in here for? He's already dead." I said, "What do you want me to do, Doc? Take him to the landfill?" He said, No, take him to the morgue." That's what kind of keeps you going, working in a place like Jasper. My first backcountry district was Blue Creek, which is in the north central part of Jasper. And part of it took in the enhancing Blue Creek, which is one of the most fascinating valleys in all of Jasper. It was the summer of 1973, and I had just been assigned the district. We worked alone 24 days, with 4 days off. Somewhere here. Until you get used to it, you have long, lonely stretches you have to adjust to. The longer you're exposed to this type of environment, though, the more precious the solitude becomes. There was a comfort you develop with yourself, as well as your surroundings, self-reliance you come to depend upon, and an attachment to the land that becomes almost sacred in nature. What I gained from these solitary experiences bordered on mystical at times. Starlit nights, splashy sunrises, glowing dusks, all rekindled a connection with spirit and wonder, and I became immersed in the marvel of it all. A howling wolf or a yapping coyote on a crisp fall night with a full moon brightening the landscape added to the magic of the bull elk bugling his stately presence. Finally, I got a chance to head up valley, and I stopped at one of my favorite warden cabins, and that is Topaz. I arrived at Topaz in the early afternoon, with plenty of time to check out the provisions in the cabin, split some firewood, and add to the kindling box. In the creek near the cabin was an inviting pool of water that begged for a fishing lure to break its calm surface. I managed to drop a red panther martin into the transition point between the pool and the faster water above. Immediately I had a strike. A nice rainbow was on the line. He fought vigorously, launching himself out of the water dancing on the surface 1 minute, then diving and darting around the bottom the next. When I landed him, he was a nice 2-pounder that barely fit the frying pan and became the main course for dinner with enough left over for breakfast. I spent another day there, and then the next morning I was eager to head farther up country. I was eager to get going the next morning, and after a quick breakfast of cereal and toast, I was saddling the ponies. Again, the trail traveled through stands of white bark pine, carpeted with bearberry, and the ever-present caribou moss. Once I broke out of the trees, which was often, I was exposed to long, continuous meadows. I encountered purple monkshood sprinkled about on the small, dry hillsides next to the trail. Later, in a rare stand of spruce, which showed signs of moisture, I was presented with a lovely display of bogwoods. The western side was endowed with countless side valleys, all, I imagine, hiding secret lakes. The eastern side showed the unbroken terrain of the ancient wall. Eventually, though, the wall gave way to open green hillsides above a band of boulder spruce. On a few occasions, the trail passed closer to the creek. I was happy to find more stretches of trout-filled stream meandering about with its deep blue pools. While riding up the middle of the valley, I happened to look up and see a band of sheep bedded down on a grassy hillside. There were between 15 and 20 of them, all lying peacefully in the sun, taking in the view, no doubt watching me and the horses coming up the valley. I was about to reach for my binoculars when suddenly, higher up, I caught something dark and dangerous running pell-mell down towards the resting sheep. It was a grizzly bear coming quickly, and he was almost in their midst before there was any apparent notice from the lounging group. Suddenly there was an explosion of activity. The bighorn were scattering in all directions. The grizzly never hesitated, continuing through the dispersing sheep with now one obvious intention: the valley bottom. Were we now his quarry? I could hear him crashing down through the timber, heading in our direction. All the horses were now attentive to the ruckus, but showed no panic as they followed the sound, plowing downward off the hillside. With my heart in my mouth, I expected at any moment to see him burst into the meadow. My eyes darted about looking for any sign of him. Where was he coming out? Then there was only silence. The sheep had settled down, and the spell was broken. I nudged Fifi on, while the others eagerly followed. The bear never appeared, and I've always wondered what his intent was. It was such a strange and puzzling event. Maybe he just wanted to put on a show. I can picture him now running through the sheep, chuckling to himself, looking down at us frozen in place in the middle of the valley. It must have made his day. I met my wife Kathy in Yoho National Park in 1975. She came there, she was hired as a seasonal warden. She was the first of 2 female wardens hired in Canada. And that was about the same time as the RCMP were hiring women for their force. It was a better experience in the warden service than it was for a lot of women in the RCMP. This story is about how I was introduced to her. It was at a local watering hole in Field, BC, and we were served by a gentleman known as Yoho Danny. Later that night, Kathy's boss, Warden Dave Reynolds, invited her down to the bar after work for a beer. Some of us joined them. At some point, I was telling her the locally famous story of Bob Sanford falling into a mill well on the Saskatchewan Glacier. At the time of the accident, Bob was a seasonal naturalist working for Parks Canada and stationed at Saskatchewan Crossing. This was before he moved up to Jasper in 1973. Bob wanted to explore the Saskatchewan Glacier and visit the Castleguard Meadows for his interpretive work. He went with a small group but all he had to wear on his feet were cowboy boots with crampons strapped to them. As he only had 2 days, he would have to walk up the glacier and into the meadows on the first day and return on the second. The accident happened on the return trip. When exhausted and unroped, he started taking shortcuts across the ice. Crossing one of the many streams in the surface of the glacier, he was picked up by the current and carried down a mill well that, much like a sink drain, was spiraling clockwise and vanishing into the depths of the glacier. He got carried down to the bottom of the glacier and found himself bobbing along in a stream, the source of the Saskatchewan River, much like a cork in the deep bowels of the ice. He eventually saw a light at the end of a long tunnel, surrounded by glowing blue walls. Who knows, maybe his whole life flashed before his eyes. Lo and behold, he popped out at the toe of the glacier, suffering from mild hypothermia, but nothing more. Being a climber, Kathy was listening to my story and thinking it was probably the biggest pile of hooey she'd ever heard. "That's impossible," she said. I was set back by her sudden retort and felt any credibility I'd built up with her was rapidly vanishing. I said, "It's true," and she rolled her eyes. At that very moment, someone I hadn't seen for a while walked through the doors of the bar. It was none other than Bob Sanford. And I said, "And there he is now. You can ask him." It was amazing. Bob had been a student of her lab class at university, where she earned a modest income as a teaching assistant while working on a master's degree in insect physiology. With my credibility somewhat restored, I ordered another round of beer. Here's the 6 degrees of separation factor. Bob had told me about his epic on the glacier when we first met in Jasper, but it was authenticated by one of his companions at the time, Eugene Noack. Eugene hadn't witnessed the event per se, but he had traveled up the glacier with Bob on his way to meet his friend Ken Forrest, who just happened to be Kathy's twin brother. I later talked to Ken about it, and he said that he had in fact met Eugene on a different trip, but still everything else was true about Bob's story. Don Forrest was the first person to climb all the 11,000 footers in the Canadian Rockies and the Columbia Mountains. Kathy's his daughter, as is her younger sister Sylvia, and over the years we did numerous trips together along with the Grizzly Group. The Grizzly Group, which I briefly introduced to the reader earlier, could best be summed up in an introduction paragraph to an Alpine Club of Canada publication written by Bob Sanford, entitled "Once Upon a Mountain." Bob writes, "It doesn't take much time traveling in mountaineering circles in Western Canada to hear about the Grizzly Group. The first I heard of them was a passing reference to a legendary circle of old mountain men who'd been climbing together for decades. When I explored the myth, I discovered that some of the members of this elite group were people I knew. I also observed that though they were somewhat grizzled, the members of the circle could hardly be said to be old. I soon discovered as well that the group's loosely established objectives were based on traditional mountaineering values that focused more on friendship, mutual reliance, and fun than on mere measure of accomplishment. For me, the group was more like an extended family. In Sylvia's potentially difficult teenage years, Don took her to the mountains with his friends. It helped keep her away from falling in with the wrong crowd, which might lead to the use of drugs and alcohol. I don't think he had to worry, but Don was thorough in everything he did, even if at times his actions seemed unconventional. Kathy and I often had Sylvia along on trips we did together. On Don's invitation, we also went out on several Grizzly Group outings. As far as Kathy and I were concerned, Sylvia was one of the original Grizzly Group members, even if she was only 13 at the time of its inception. Her climbing abilities were established very early in life. One of Don's philosophies was that a bad day in the mountains would always trump a good day in the city. That was a pretty common attitude back then with the group. They got their name in July 1973 while laden with heavy packs and trudging up the steep trail that led to the Lyell Meadows and the lateral moraine below. When they finally reached the meadow, one of them spotted a big pile of dung, still steaming in the cool air. While the rest of the group took refreshment from a nearby creek, Don went off with his pack, looking for a suitable campsite. Partway along, he dropped his pack and carried on. He and the grizzly saw each other at the same time. Don slowly backed off, saying, "Woof, woof," like a dog. He passed his pack before he realized he was leaving it behind. Continuing his dog impersonation, he started moving slowly forward to retrieve his pack. That's when the bear stood up to survey the group. After getting a whiff of them, he dropped down on all fours and lumbered away, up a slope and out of sight. After that encounter, they started calling themselves the Grizzly Group. As they put it later, the name stuck like bear dung to a sleeping bag. The 5 original members of this group were Glenn Bowles, Don Forrest, Leon Kubernis, Gordon Scruggs, and Mike Simpson. Those that followed were Frank Campbell, Walt Davis, Jim Fosty, Bill Hurst, Bob Jordan, Ron Matthews, Rolly Reeder, Peter Roxburgh, and Bruno Struck. Years later, while working on her book about her dad, Kathy asked several members of the group to define themselves as they answered in various ways. It was Mike Simpson who summed it up best. The Grizzly Group sort of epitomizes what we would call camaraderie in the mountains. The level of trust between 4 or 5 people that exists initially was a total one. I mean, you didn't have to be concerned about your safety or whether somebody would come to rescue if there was a problem. In all of our objectives, our interests were common. The fact that the whole trip was important, not just getting to the summit. Over the years, we ended up developing a great interest in other things besides mountaineering, like geology through Gordon Scruggs, our resident geologist. Don added that one of the group's distinguishing traits was the use of the rope. As the group aged, he claimed their motto became, "If we have to take out the rope, we must be on the wrong mountain." Since we took out the rope a lot, we were often on the wrong mountain. I just want to follow up. The path that is laid out for us in our brief mortal struggle on Earth is often veiled and enigmatic, but if we pay attention and observe closely, we can sometimes see the hazy signposts that help us understand our life and the path to follow. The mountains open a doorway to a greater understanding of why I took a path that seemed at times obscure and dangerous to others. Some of the training and work required risk that in hindsight gave me a greater appreciation of what life had to offer. I put great value in these experiences as it extended my opportunities by giving me the confidence to undertake adventures I might otherwise have avoided. It also helped me to understand myself better. To do so, I needed to build the confidence to deal with whatever circumstance was thrown my way. The Warden service was the perfect vehicle for it. Thank you, everyone.